What's up guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello! My name is Erica, and it is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, we are going to be chatting about Sarah J. Maas's ACOTAR series. But before we can get into that, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. And now that you have so kindly joined this nerdy corner of the internet, let's get into today's video. Okay, let's start, actually, before we get into all the analysis and all the stuff I want to talk about, let's begin by kind of giving you guys a breakdown of what to expect from this video. So these books are not based on Greek myth. However, as I was reading it, I noticed a lot of Greek mythology influences on the story. Now, Sarah J. Maas has publicly said that obviously lots of different mythologies and lots of different laws do influence this story across all 5 books that are out now. In case you guys are watching at the end of 2025, there will have been a 6th, so there may be a part 2, depending on what I can find in that book. But she has mentioned how many different mythologies have influenced her fantasy series. I'm just not qualified to talk about all of them. I am qualified to talk about Greek mythology. I'm a classicist if you're new here, and so therefore I spend a lot of time in ancient Greece and Rome. And as I was reading, it was really apparent that there were some of those really important hallmark stories to the ancients that played a role in at least how some of the characters acted, how some of the characters progressed, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So that is exclusively what I'm going to be talking about today. If you happen to know more about the Celtic lore, for example, that does play a role, you know, please feel free to leave a comment at any point. Let us know any other videos where people have done a really good job with that kind of stuff so that we can all kind of have this little like mythology, ACOTAR community here on YouTube. So the structure of this video is really going to be discussing the first 2 books at great length, and then there are lots of references in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th books which we'll be touching on. But because they're more so fleeting rather than the overall storyline being used, it's really going to kind of be, you know, talking about this book, talking about the 2nd book, and then having a list of references where I'm just going to kind of go through them and iron those out for you guys. They're kind of like blink and you'll miss it references. So that will be happening 3rd. But when it comes to the first 2 books, I'm going to read you guys the blurb. We're then going to talk about the myth that I think, well, that is pretty apparent that has played a role in writing the story. And then we're going to combine it all together to do some analysis and just more so some like nitpicking about, you know, certain elements of the myths and how they came up and so on and so forth. And therefore, the reason why I did all of this intro is so that you guys know there will be spoilers ahead. There is no way that I can do this video without doing spoilers, and so therefore if you haven't read the entire series, I would advise that you read it and then come back to this video later. Or if you want to continue watching, just know that there are spoilers. I don't want to ruin this series for anybody, but if you choose to keep watching, you have done so at your own risk. So we're not doing a normal book review. I won't be telling you my personal opinions. We're just going to be pointing some things out, and hopefully we will have a good time and walk away knowing some more things in case we didn't, which is all I want to do on this channel. All I want to do is get you guys excited about the ancient world, get you guys excited to read more things. So I'll be linking you guys as well to other texts that you guys can go and dive into these Greek myths. I'm very, very excited. And so with that being said, let's dive right in. Court of Thorns and Roses. Flaroh is a huntress. The skin of a wolf would bring enough gold to feed her sisters for a month. But the life of a magical creature comes at a steep price, and Flaroh has just killed the wrong wolf. Taken prisoner by a high lord, Flaroh learns that her masked captor is hiding even more than his piercing gaze suggests. But as Flaroh's feelings for Tamlin begin to burn through every warning she's heard about his kind, a shadow is falling across the land. And if Flaroh cannot fight it, she will lose everything. So I know that online already everybody is saying that A Court of Thorns and Roses, the first in the series, is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. But did you know that Beauty and the Beast is a retelling of an ancient myth? This is the myth of Eros and Psyche, or if you're using Roman names, it would be Cupid and Psyche. And technically, since we have this from a Roman sources, we should be using Cupid and Psyche, but I have gotten so used to saying Eros and Psyche. I'm probably going to interchange them, but yeah, they're the same person. What's really interesting is that we call Psyche and Eros a myth, especially us classists call it a myth, when technically we should really be calling it a fairy tale. In fact, we get this story not on its own in a source like Ovid or in a source like Hesiod. Even though we do have certain references to it here, there, and everywhere, the actual telling of the story comes to us in Apuleius's The Golden Ass. Get your head out of the gutter, I mean a donkey. The Golden Ass is actually a novel that comes to us from ancient Rome. It's really fun when we have these stories where it's like, oh, this wasn't supposed to be some really deep myth, this wasn't supposed to be some influential text, it was just a guy that wrote a book for entertainment. And that's what The Golden Ass is. And this fairy tale comes to us smack bang in the middle of it, pretty much. So the stories of this guy, I won't explain the whole thing, the stories of this guy, and he gets turned into a donkey. And in the middle of this book, as he's on his like very long donkey journey, this sounds so much like The Emperor's New Groove now that I say it out loud. But as he's on this journey, he gets told the fairy tale of Psyche and Eros. And the story goes something like this. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, no, we are not told where this land is. This is very traditional fairy tale where it's just a far off place, right? And people live there. And the king who lives there has 3 daughters. Now, 2 of his daughters he's already married off, but the youngest daughter is known for her beauty. She is just drop dead gorgeous. And I mean, her beauty is so famous that it gets spread throughout all the land. So much so that people, the men mainly, they just start gawking at her. Like they want to come and visit her. They want to just stare at her because she is almost inhuman. She is godly, right? She is so beautiful that the people who come and look at her forget about the goddess Aphrodite, or if you're looking at Roman names, it would be Venus, right? So that's the goddess of love. And the goddess is not thrilled about this whatsoever, as you guys could probably guess. And so Venus, Aphrodite, gets her son, Cupid Eros, to agree to go and shoot Psyche with one of his arrows, which will force Psyche to fall in love with an ugly monster. When Eros, Cupid, runs off to go and do his mother's bidding, he sees Psyche, and he as well falls madly in love with her. In fact, he's so in love with her that he manages to scratch himself with the tip of one of his arrows. And yes, before you guys go running to the comments, one of those arrows that makes you fall more madly in love, or just in love, but in this case, more madly in love with the object of your desire. Meanwhile, in Psyche's real world, things aren't looking that great for her. Her father starts to realize that there is a big problem, because even though, yes, all of these men want to come and look at Psyche, none of them seem to want to marry her. And unfortunately, this is the ancient world, and so therefore, to have a daughter that you can't marry off is pretty fucking useless. I hate saying this stuff as a woman, but at the same time, such is the story. Therefore, the king decides to go to the oracle to ask and beg for any man, just a man, to be sent to marry his Psyche. And he is told that she is destined to have a husband. However, the husband is going to be this gross, serpent-like monster. And obviously, I mean, her dad, distraught. The king is instructed to bring Psyche to the peak of this great, great mountain, where her new husband will come to take her away. And once alone, Psyche is then lifted by a gentle breeze and brought to her new home. And some way, somehow, she ends up falling asleep during this whole thing. Don't ask, that's a little bit of a technical detail, but she manages to wake up when she's already been delivered to her new home. And when she wakes up, she finds herself in a really lush meadow. She gets up, she goes to explore the land, and discovers a huge home where she is destined to live. And so when she shows up at this house, and it's like banging, she's having a great time, right? She's like, even if he is a monster, I have a palace that I live in. And not only that, but in this palace, Psyche's actually met by a clamor of voices. Though she can't see anyone, the house comes fit with all of these like bodiless attendants. And the voices tell her that this is now hers. And the reason why the palace is hers is because she is married to the master of the house. When night rolls around, Psyche is nervous, knowing that her husband is going to return and probably join her in bed. However, when her husband, who we as the audience know is Cupid or Eros, but Psyche does not, when he does come home, he aims to conceal his identity from her. Now, he's very gracious to her, he's very kind to her, really sweet to Psyche, but he refuses to tell her who he is. The only request that Cupid makes of Psyche is that she is never to ask to see him, and instead, she must choose to trust that their love is strong enough to keep them close. Psyche agrees, but as time passes, slowly but surely this starts to frustrate her. Understandably. And so, Psyche requests that her sisters come visit her, so that she can see at least someone. And Eros, Cupid, her husband, agrees. And when they show up, they start asking her, who are you married to? What does he look like? If you think he's this really nice guy, how can you trust that he's a really nice guy if you don't know him, if you don't know what he looks like? And slowly, but surely, they start to influence her. And when they leave, Psyche decides that she has to know who her husband is, that there is no way that she can just trust this blind wisp in the dark that she has never seen. There is just no way. So Psyche waits until the cover of night. She lights a candle, and she walks over to where her husband is sleeping and places the candle very close to his face to try and get a good look. Psyche does not see the monster that she was expecting, but instead a gorgeously handsome man. And on his bedside table, she sees a set of arrows. And so she goes down to inspect those, and she runs her hand along them and pricks her finger in the process, which, as we know, based on the Cupid thing and based on the Eros thing, this is going to cause her to fall much, much more madly in love with him. However, in all of her silent celebrating, a little teeny tiny bit of wax falls on Cupid, falls on Eros, and he wakes up. And he rolls over to see that Psyche is staring right at him. And he is distraught. He is so upset. Right? Cupid cannot even handle the idea that she's done this. And he says that love cannot exist without trust. And he mutters this as he walks out of the house in a rage. He storms out. Psyche, on the other hand, starts to feel so guilty for what she's done as she realizes how much she loves Eros and how much she wants him back. And so she does the only thing that she thinks she can do, and that's go to Aphrodite, go to Venus herself. And when she gets there, she begs for forgiveness. And the goddess says, if you want to win back my son's love, you must complete several tasks. So task number one that Aphrodite, or Venus, has Psyche do is that she takes her to a huge lump of all of these different seeds and grains, and she tells Psyche to separate them. She wants them in completely different piles. Psyche, realizing this is going to take her an age, thinks that, she's pretty much been defeated at the first road, but she goes and she tries. And luckily for Psyche, this is very long story short, luckily for Psyche, some ants come and they help her separate things out, which angers Aphrodite, but at the same time, she's done it. The second task that Aphrodite has Psyche do is she wants her to cross a raging river and collect the golden fleece from these super violent sheep that live on the other side. Now, when Psyche gets into the water, she's advised by a reed and tells her to stay away from the sheep actually altogether until nightfall. Only then should she go and collect the wool that's hanging in the wood. And Psyche listens, and she does this successfully. Task number 3 sees Psyche going to the source of the river Styx to collect some water for the goddess. Psyche agrees, and when Psyche goes down, she realizes that the river is just crazy, right? There is no way that anyone can get close to it. She again realizes that she's been set up for failure. She is ready to kind of be oh no, what am I gonna do? Luckily for her, there's an eagle nearby, which Jupiter, if you're thinking in Roman names, or Zeus in Greek names, has sent to help. So he feels bad for her, and so he sends this eagle down. The eagle goes, picks up some water in the container, and Psyche successfully completes the task. The final task that Aphrodite asks Psyche to do is she gives her a box and she tells her to go down to the underworld to meet Persephone and to put in a bit of Persephone's beauty into this box to bring back to Aphrodite. Psyche, against all the odds, manages to do this. She goes all the way to the underworld. She meets Persephone, and Persephone is very, very happy to help Aphrodite and to do this thing. And Psyche returns with the box. However, Psyche is warned by a tower, which we do not have time to get into. We didn't get into the read, we're not getting into the tower. You just have to trust me. The tower tells Psyche not to open the box, right? Now that she's holding it, she is overcome with curiosity. It is like Pandora 2.0 out here. And Psyche opens the box. To her surprise, inside, there is no beauty. And we'll come back to that in a hot second, because actually, as this is all going on, Cupid, or Eros, finds himself really missing his wife. He's longing to be near Psyche. And so he decides to leave to go and find her. And he does. Now, what was in that box that Psyche opened was not beauty, but was in fact this like crazy deep sleep, like all-encompassing sleep. But luckily our little winged hero wakes her up, because he's a god, he can do that, and he tells her to complete the task while he goes to talk to Jupiter, Zeus, to ask for help against his mother. So Psyche completes the task, she goes and she gives the box to Aphrodite, and meanwhile Cupid manages to convince all of the gods to have the marriage of Psyche and Eros legitimized by them. And they live happily ever after, basically. Psyche passes all of her tests, and actually as reward, Psyche is then made immortal. So that's like the cute little ending to this happily ever after, which never happens in mythology, and we love it. So that was a non-specific version of the myth, and I do want to make that clear. When you read it in Apuleius, it is referenced in other places. There are lots of different versions throughout history of this story as well, leading up to Beauty and the Beast. It's a very general idea, right? But I think you guys can see, since we're all ACOTAR fans here, I think you guys can see exactly how much of that story, more so than Beauty and the Beast, though there are obviously lots of overlaps, influenced this first book. I mean, it's literally basically an exact retelling, even down to the number of sisters, the fact that they are married off. When it comes to Feyre and her sisters, Nesta and Elaine, like Nesta and Elaine are at least engaged, or like about to be engaged. Quickly, Erica editing coming in here, and I did miss out the fact that in the myth and the fairy tale of Psyche and Eros, the sisters in the myth do as well want to believe that Psyche's new husband is a monster, just like Feyre's sisters want to believe that Tamlin, who's a fairy, and he's a shape-shifting being, is also a monster. So that is also very much in the same realm, that like they see him as being a monster. They're convinced that he's a monster, but unlike Psyche's sisters, they are not letting that like ruin everything, as you guys know. So progress. We've got progress in retelling a story, but still very much aligned. Okay, sorry about that. Now I'm leaving. Back to the video. And obviously this is fantasy, so we don't have exact matches, but Feyre is our Psyche, whereas Tamlin in this book, because obviously this changes in the second book, but in the first book, Tamlin is our Eros. I mean, much like Psyche, not knowing that Eros is a god when she's married to him initially, Feyre has zero idea, even when she meets Tamlin and goes to the Spring Court, that he is the High Lord of the Spring Court. Obviously, she can't see who he is because of the mask on, so that's, dealing with that whole cover of night that Eros had in the story, and is more so leaning into the Beauty and the Beast kind of thing, where he's dressed as a beast and she can't see his true form. But, Tamlin is wearing a mask. That is our Eros versus our Psyche in the immediate setup. The curse aspect is more so a Beauty and the Beast thing rather than a Psyche and Eros thing. That's something that adapts throughout the ages, where there's a curse that's brought in, that whole like magical thing. And I guess you could say Aphrodite. God. I guess you could say Aphrodite's the curse. That might be a really bad thing to say about his mother. So even though there's no curse aspect, there is still the aspect of Feyre wanting to know that her sisters are okay. She wants to go and see them. She can't go and see them, obviously. She does want to see Nesta and Elaine. She ultimately goes back. Obviously, then the curse kind of weaves into that, so that's not really Psyche and Eros, and not really Beauty and the Beast either. It's kind of like a fantasy version, intersection of all three of those things. But when she returns and finds Tamlin gone, and knows that she has to go and get him, it's that same structure as Psyche and Eros. It's that same structure where Feyre is held prisoner, and she has to go through these three different tasks. Now, obviously, those are different in the fantasy world. There are no giant worms in ancient Greece. That is just in this book. And there's no, I can't read the writing on the wall and Lucian might die because of it. But part of this story was also that not only does she have to do the 3 tasks in order to get Tamlin back, and then obviously the Spring Court back, which are kind of, 2 in 1 based on the baddie of this book. But also that she has to do, in the meantime, a lot of like menial tasks, whatever it is that this evil queen like wants her to do. And one of those things, if you guys remember, is Feyre cleaning out the fireplace in Rhysand's room. I think it's Rhysand's room. But either way, she has to do this fireplace because it has all these lentils in it. And she's got to pick up all of the individual lentils to clean them up. Doesn't that sound like task 1? I literally was reading that and I was like, oh, you just plucked this from EROS and Psyche. I don't hate it. I love it. I love that was done. But there are always these really interesting ways of, even though they don't work for the high drama of the fantasy series, like you couldn't have had the lentil scene as one of her tasks. That just like wouldn't have worked. But it worked really well as a menial task that she had to do, which was still a callback to the ancient story. But the last task of this book and of Psyche is to go to hell and back, essentially, right? Even though the underworld, there is hell within the underworld and there are good things within the underworld, but it's the idea of dying to then come back. And even though Psyche doesn't die in the ancient mythology, she goes to the underworld, she ventures to the underworld, and she makes it back alive, which is, she's one of what, 3 people? 4 people? 4. I've said that with a lot of confidence. It's literally like on a single hand, the amount of people in mythology to go and do that. And I think she's the only woman to go down and do that. I'm saying that without any notes in front of me, but all the other people I can think of are men. And Feyre too has to die for a hot second in order to then come back. And in the same way that when Psyche shows up and Hermes or Mercury has to go and tell, Eros or Cupid and be like, this is happening, you need to come back, like this is amazing, blah, blah, blah. In the same way that the gods step in there, all of the high lords of this whole court system that they have going on in this fantasy world, they all have to step forward in order to save Feyre. And so it's like this really nice mirroring with the ancient myth that I think comes to a beautiful close, as at least without these 2 other and these books, without any of those, just as a standalone, they live happily ever after. So that's Eros and Psyche in the first book. Again, I want to keep stressing, I know that there are other mythologies that are used, but for me it was so obvious in the first one that it was like, oh my god, you're just retelling Eros and Psyche. And I think she did it so beautifully and so fresh and in such a new way that it's such a fun way to get people to engage with that myth, or have people read this, not realize it's a myth, and then go back. Okay, to be fair, to jump from this to Apuleius is a bit of a jump because Apuleius is really weird. But it is still such a good thing that we should be attaching onto this book more of a way for people to be getting into mythology and getting excited about it. But luckily, that's not the only book that actually uses Greek mythology. And in A Court of Mist and Fury, we retell Hades and Persephone. Feyre is immortal. She has rescued her lover Tamlin from the sadistic fairy queen and now possesses fairy powers beyond imagining. But Feyre cannot forget the destruction she wrought to save her beloved, nor the bargain she made with Rhysand, High Lord of the feared Night Court. And as Feyre is drawn ever deeper into Rhysand's world, she senses a dark pain in his heart that echoes her own. For good or ill, Feyre must embrace the changes within her. War is looming, and only the full might of her new powers can save the people she loves. At the end of A Court in Thorns and Roses, we begin to see Tamlin kind of cracking. I mean, to be fair, I'm gonna be real with you guys. When I read this book, I could have, taken or left Tamlin. I really wasn't taken by him at all. I wasn't excited by him as our little hero. I was like, yay, great, okay, cool. If he's gonna be the romantic lead of this whole series, I'm a struggle. Thank God he's not, because the minute I saw Rhysand, I was like, who's the hottie with the body? Need more of him. But book 2 is not the first time that we meet Rhysand. We meet him in the first book, and I'll be discussing how when we meet him in the first book, as Feyre is doing her tasks and he comes down to see her in her cell, how we begin talking about Hades and Persephone in this particular book, because it technically starts about halfway through A Court of Thorns and Roses, and then it goes through all of book 2. But before we can do that, I need to remind you guys of the myth of Hades and Persephone. Because unfortunately, the myth is not the one that we keep retelling over and over and over again. And that is not me saying, oh, we need to tell it correctly. I love retellings of Hades and Persephone. I do sometimes get tired of Hades always being the same, or the Hades character being the same. I don't think Rhysand is the same, and that's why I think I liked this one so much. But I like the idea of over-romanticizing that story, because the ancient version is so incredibly dark that if we were going to keep going over the ancient one in the way that the ancients did, we'd all be very troubled, probably more so than a lot of people already are, just because of how dark and how heavy the story is. So I'm not going to be doing it that hard. You guys can read the myth for yourself in the Homeric hymns, which is a collection of poems from ancient Greece. We call them the Homeric hymns because they are attributed to Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, because they're in a similar style to him, but they're not all written by him. But it is a collection of poems that are hymns to each god, right? And some of them are fragmentary, some of them are 1 or 2 lines, some of them are full-on poems. And the hymn to Demeter, fortunately for us, is one of the more intact ones. There are parts of it that we don't necessarily know. If you guys read it, you'll see it will just kind of have like little brackets next to a broken line. But the myth is there if you guys want to read it in full. I'm going to do, kind of like I just did with Eros and Psyche, a nice little shorter version before we can start lining up that myth to Sarah J. Maas's version in book 2. So let's go back to ancient Greece, right? This is like really far back, chronologically speaking, in Greek mythology, because we are going back to the time right after the Olympians defeat the Titans in a war. I know that sounds really weird if you're not in Greek mythology, but there are lots of wars, lots of gods fighting, lots of overthrowing. It's very dramatic. We love it there. And this particular time, the Titans, who are the parents and the older generation from the Olympian gods, who are the famous ones that we know, they had ruled. Kronos, who is Zeus and all of theirs father, because there are 6 of them, their father is a problem. Surprise, surprise. And so they decide to overthrow him. And when they do, they then have to basically divvy up everything along the earth, right? So all of these things that all of these titans who are now thrown in Tartarus, who are now, they've disappeared, need to hand over their jurisdictions to the Olympians. And so Zeus, the first thing that he does is he gets his brothers, not his sisters. There are 6 of them. He only decides that him, Poseidon, and Hades, they are going to divvy up the 3 main parts of the world, right? Which is the sky, the sea, and the underworld. And they all like pull straws, and Hades gets the short end of the stick, right? Quite literally. And he ends up getting the underworld. So he fucks off, goes down there. Zeus, Poseidon go to their own little things. Zeus ends up marrying Hera. He ends up having like a bajillion affairs. One of the affairs that he has with Hera is actually his other sister, Demeter, who is the goddess of harvest, right? So crops, harvesting, super important. And their child from that is Persephone. Poseidon also has a wife called Amphitrite, and he's also running around, and Hades is in the underworld completely alone. And he is very aware of how alone he is. So according to this myth, he goes to Zeus and he explains the situation where he's like, the underworld is filled with dead people and I'm pretty lonely and I would like to have a wife or like someone who's not dead come and hang out with me down there. And so Zeus, without discussing this further properly, he says to Hades, I have this daughter who's really young, who's single, who's really beautiful. Her name's Persephone. You can have her, but just like don't tell her mum, because Demeter's gonna be like super pissed off if she finds out that I've done this. She would never agree to it. So like just go and take her whenever you see the time is right. Hades hears, he waits his sweet time, and when Persephone, our young maiden, is running around in the field and she is picking flowers and she's hanging out, the ground suddenly opens up in front of her. And out from this crack in the ground appears Hades on a chariot. Persephone is terrified and she starts screaming. Like, we are told that her screams are just bouncing off of the landscape and going berserk. And despite that, he picks her up all the while she's screaming, puts her in his chariot, and abducts her down to the underworld. Right? This is made explicitly clear. And that's why I know I'm going to be making a lot of enemies with this, but it is explicitly clear that she goes totally against her will and she screams and she cries the whole time. Now, with all the screaming and crying bouncing off all over the place, Demeter does hear this, and so she knows that something has happened. However, when she goes to find Persephone, she can't seem to locate her. She goes everywhere. I mean, Demeter is distraught. This part of the myth should break everybody's heart because Demeter is running around just trying to find out where her daughter has gone. She searches for 9 days. And on the 10th day, Hecate, who is the goddess of witchcraft, she has these torches. And she shows up and she's like, oh, these torches, we can help. So I'm going to come around with you. Where was she for the previous 9 days? Genuinely, I don't know. And it always bothers me when I read the myth because I'm like, we could have used you like day 2. Like, what is happening? Regardless, Hecate shows up with her torches and suggests that they go to Helios, who's the sun god, because he was on duty. Since this was in the middle of the day, he might know something. And when the two women go to Helios, Helios tells them that he does know exactly what happens and tells her that Hades has taken Persephone to the underworld. Demeter is distraught by this. She is so upset because as an Olympian, she can't go down there and get her daughter back. And she demands that Persephone come home. And it's not a case of Persephone not wanting to come home. It's a case of Persephone not knowing. And so Demeter weeps. She mourns, she weeps, she cries. She cannot contain her grief that her daughter was taken away from her. No less by the permission of her father. Like, it's just so incredibly fucked. And in Demeter's pain, she can't do her job. And because of that, the crops start to die. And because the crops start to die and things don't grow, people can't eat. And if people can't eat, then people start dying. And unfortunately, this is what makes Zeus pay attention. Yeah, it doesn't matter that like a mother is grieving for her daughter. It doesn't matter that he's allowed his brother to come and abduct his daughter, who is his brother's niece, in order to marry without the mother's permission. Like, that doesn't bother him. It's the fact that people are not getting fed and so people can't worship him. That's a problem. Zeus sends Hermes down to the underworld and tells him to tell Hades to send Persephone back because people need to live so that they can tell him how great he is. And when Hermes goes down there, Hades does not put up a fight. Hades is very, very happy to send Persephone back. However, right before she leaves with Hermes, he says, you know, it's not the most comfortable journey back up to the surface. Why don't you have something to eat? And he feeds her pomegranate seeds. Now, this does change from version to version, not just the version that I'm talking about, but the number of seeds changes. It could be 6, it could be 3. That's not really all that important. But regardless, she eats the pomegranate seeds and then she's returned to the surface. And Demeter is thrilled to see her daughter. Like, she's elated. She's so excited. And it is so heartwarming to see the mother finally get reunited with her daughter. And one of the first things that she says is, please tell me you didn't eat anything when you were down there. And Persephone's like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, no one ever told me that there were like terms and conditions to the underworld. I did eat something. I had some pomegranate seeds. And it's then that we find out that if you eat anything in the underworld, you are bound to that realm. Which means that Hades did that knowing that that would happen. He did that without telling her. And he forced her to have those pomegranate seeds so that she would return back. And therefore, that's why every single year she has to go back for a certain amount of time. And it's in those months, which are the winter months, that Demeter mourns. And that's why nothing grows. And then in the spring, when Persephone is returned, everything is in full bloom once again. So very, very dark, okay? I'm aware, and I know that probably a lot of people like mentally clocked off from that because it's not Scarlett St. Clair's Hades Persephone series. It's not B. Fitzgerald's Girl Goddess Queen. It is dark shit. And that is important. However, that is not the story that is retold in A Court of Mist and Fury. In fact, this is a lovely romantic version of the story that does start in A Court of Thorns and Roses. So when we meet Rhysand, when he comes down to the cell, as I was mentioning before, he gives Persephone a bargain. And he says, I will help you. I will heal your arm. I will make sure it's not broken so that you can do the next task. However, I want you to come to the Night Court once a week, every single month. Well, okay, actually, it ends up being once a week, but they do barter. You guys know that. They like have a little back and forth where they try and like negotiate, and it comes down to once a week. And then when she agrees, she gets the whole thing, you know, like tattooed on her. So she's got the whole, I have made a deal, like out in the open. And even though in the ancient myth, as you guys just heard, there is no agency that is given to Persephone, like, whatsoever. And that's a crucial part of that story. She has none. She has no say in it. There are later versions where she does fall in love with Hades, possibly, like, over time. She's okay with it, but it is made very clear it is against her will. She has absolutely no say in it. This gives Flaroh, who is now our Persephone, she kind of goes from being our Psyche to being our Persephone and kind of morphing into our Persephone. She has more agency. She agrees to this deal with Rhysand. And this idea of like a bargain that is not manipulated in any kind of way is the common trope that we see in modern Hades and Persephone retellings. I just mentioned Scarlet's book. That's a great example of another bargain. We have as well Sav R. Miller. Oh no, Sav R. Miller's is really dark, actually. If you guys want like a smutty mafia romance, Hades and Persephone, that is actually as dark as the original myth, try Sav's as well. But this idea of giving Persephone more agency is very much the modern side of the myth. And actually in this book, as you guys know, we don't see Rhysand show up to claim his bargain, claim his end of the bargain, claim his winnings, whatever we're gonna call that. But he doesn't show up for 3 months, actually. There's 3 months of silence from him where he doesn't come to take her. And when he actually shows up, it's, as you guys know, at the wedding. Tamlin has his hand out and she's like internally screaming like, help me, save me, I can't do this. And Rhysand poofs up from nowhere and takes her to the night court. Now again, we take out a lot of that violence and instead it is much more of a give and take when it comes to that relationship. She doesn't want to be at the wedding anyways, she realizes. Rhysand comes to take her and then she is bound for a week, but then she starts to enjoy kind of going there. It's a little like holiday home. And it's much more frequent than Persephone goes to the underworld, but the idea is there. Now, what isn't in the ancient myth, but I have some thoughts on in 1 second, which is the idea of Flaroh being between 2 men, is not in the original Persephone story, even though there are references to Persephone being pursued by other deities. She is not, engaged to anybody else. There is no other wedding in that kind of a sense. She is a young maiden who is on her own, single Pringle, running around in a field. Whereas Flaroh has another guy and then gets taken away to the night court. And obviously, when it comes to the night court, Rhysand is very much a Hades in that sort of very much on the surface kind of level, right? This night court is very much like our underworld. And this idea that we have in modern Hades and Persephone retellings where Hades has a really hard exterior because that's his job, right? Rhysand is the High Lord of the Night Court. It is his job to be scary and spooky and like make sure that everybody stays in line. And that's very similar to the modern idea of Hades. It's not necessarily the truth about Hades. We actually don't have a lot of mythology about Hades, which I think is why so many people love taking the Hades and Persephone story, because the ancients didn't talk about Hades. He's a scary person. You don't have stories about that person. And Rhysand is more so our modern idea, which is he has a front, but his front isn't all of him. And Flaroh over time does fall in love with him. Obviously they are mated. She doesn't know that, but still there's that idea of her not wanting to be there in the beginning. And then she ends up liking being there. She ends up falling in love with not, the High Lord of the Night Court, but with Rhysand, who's the guy that's behind that. And she, understands that there is a public image and a behind the mask, which again is more so our idea of a modern Hades and Persephone and not the ancient version. But those ideas are still there. And also the fact that Flaroh goes to the Night Court from the Spring Court. So even though she's not, a goddess of spring or like a high fae of the Spring Court, she is still attached to the Spring Court, has the potential to be the queen of the Spring Court. Well, she wouldn't be the queen. What was it that he was going to call her? Can't remember, but you know what I mean? Like, she's going to be very high up. She's going to marry Tamlin, and she ends up going to the Night Court instead. So that spring, that like darkness kind of side of things, they do match up beautifully with the ancient myth. So I did just say to you guys that I wanted to mention Flaroh being between Tamlin and Rhysand throughout at least the second book, or even between the first and second book, this idea that she goes from one court to the other, from one man to the other. And even though that's not attached to either of the myths, right? It's not attached to the Eros and Psyche or Cupid and Psyche myth, nor is it attached to the Hades and Persephone myth. There is one very prominent myth from ancient Greek mythology that is pretty obviously inspiring that, of 2 very strong men, very strong kings of two very prominent places that are fighting over a beautiful woman. And if you haven't guessed it, that's Helen of Troy. Helen of Troy, Helen of Sparta. She technically starts as Helen of Sparta and she morphed into Helen of Troy. So I'm going to very briefly explain what that is. Now, before I do, I just want to let you guys know, I do not think that any of these books are a retelling of the Trojan War whatsoever, nor do I think it's a retelling of Helen of Sparta, Helen of Troy, right? That's not what I'm saying. But the idea of these two men fighting over a woman, but it's really kind of about them, that's really what I'm trying to get at. That it's like those motifs that are in there, those tropes that are in there, so similar to Paris and Menelaus. But who is Helen? She is the queen of Sparta. She becomes Helen of Troy. But she was first and foremost the daughter of Zeus and her mortal mother, Leda. So Helen is famous for being the most beautiful woman in the world, right? She's the face that launched 1,000 ships. However, when she started off, she was literally born from an egg, and that's because Zeus had disguised himself as a swan to hook up with her mum. This is mythology. You need to get rid of logic and just accept what's happening. But I presume because you enjoy fantasy, you're used to doing that. So that's what happened in this case. And Leda ends up birthing Helen from an egg, out hatches this beautiful ray of sunshine, and she doesn't get raised by Zeus, she gets raised by her mortal father, who is Leda's husband, called Tyndareus. Now, when Helen comes of age, she does have some childhood stories. We're not getting into that because that's not the point of this video, nor does that actually impact the story I'm trying to tell. But when she comes of age to get married, her father Tyndareus tells like everyone. He has the most beautiful woman in the world as his child. He needs to find somebody to inherit Sparta because he's the king of Sparta, but obviously he's got to hand that over at some point. He's going to get too old. He's going to die. So he needs to find the new guy to rule the whole thing and take Helen on his hand. He tells everyone that they're going to have a competition in order for somebody to literally win Helen and win Sparta. And he invites everybody to come and everyone shows up. I mean, literally this is like, I always say that the Trojan War is like the Avengers, but like really knowing that all of them were trying to also court and win Helen, so all of them were at Sparta at one point, like competing, is also like part of the Avengers. It's really wild. So they all show up, but Menelaus ends up winning. Now Menelaus has like a whole fucked backstory that has nothing to do with this, but in case you were curious about the House of Atreus, I do have a video on the House of Atreus that you can watch because that is a mess. But he ends up winning Helen's hand, he ends up winning Sparta. And before he's actually crowned the winner, the men start noticing that everybody's getting really territorial of Helen and of Sparta and wanting to win. And so one of them who's competing is a man called Odysseus. He is our wily king of an island called Ithaca. And so he sees everybody being really territorial. He goes to Tyndareus, the king of Sparta at this time. He talks to all of the guys and he gets everyone to agree to a pact where essentially they are going to respect whoever it is that wins Helen's hand. And they are all going to agree, they're going to swear an oath and agree that if any of them decide to disrespect Helen's husband, they decide to go and pick Helen up and abduct her and take her back. They decide that they want to win all of that. All of the other men who are there will go and fight this person, right? So it's basically like, we're going to make sure that all of us stay in line by saying if anybody wants to go back on respecting the winner, we're all going to come and attack you and destroy your city and destroy the ones that you love. Which you would think would really work, right? And all of the men are like, oh my god, this is such a great idea. Such a brilliant idea. Let's swear this oath. Probably because they all think that they're going to win, which is quite funny because it ends up being Menelaus. But none of them, not a single one of them, assume that a foreign king is going to show up and take Helen back to his foreign kingdom. And that's exactly what happens because Paris shows up in Sparta and Helen either falls in love with him or he abducts her. It's like one or the other. But regardless, she gets on the boat and she goes to Troy. And this is the catalyst for the Trojan War. That you have one guy who gets something that he feels like he deserved because he won it and he's like, yeah, it's mine. And then another guy shows up and he goes, she's really hot, I'm younger than you, I'm really hot, she's coming with me. And everybody's like bro, what? Enter Sarah J. Maas. I'm not saying that this is a Trojan War retelling, because when it comes to A Court of Wings and Ruin, that is absolutely not the Trojan War. That is its own fantasy world. However, the dynamic between Feyre, Tamlin, and Rhysand is so close to that of Menelaus, Paris, and Helen. And a lot of Feyre really reminds me of Helen. Like, something that people don't really know about Helen because people don't tend to read the Iliad, which makes me so sad. But Helen is a savage. Like, she is so great. I mean, she is so smart, she is so quick, and she knows how to play the game. Because we find out that actually, at the time that we meet her in the Iliad, she fucking hates Paris, right? So obviously this is a little bit different because Paris would be our Rhysand and Tamlin would be our Menelaus, but she hates Paris and she's always saying like, oh, I wish you died on the battlefield. Oh, it's so annoying that you've come back. She wakes up every day and she chooses violence, and I'm obsessed with her. But the way that Feyre is so strong, and she is so clever, and she knows how to fight, but she also, especially when she goes back to the Spring Court, she knows exactly how to play that role, right? Like, she knows what she has to do in order to get out of there alive. Even when it comes to the end of A Court of Mist and Fury, and we have all of that with the cauldron, and she has to, like, you know, kind of pretend that, oh my goodness, Rhysand was evil and he put this spell on me. She knows how to play the game in the same way that Helen knows that she has to act in a certain way towards Paris because Aphrodite, she had promised Paris Helen, and so when Helen doesn't want to do things, Aphrodite comes to threaten Helen. Like, literally at one point in book 3 of the Iliad, Aphrodite picks up Helen, and then she picks up a chair and puts the chair in front of Paris, and then puts Helen in front of Paris in the chair and forces Helen to hang out with Paris, even though Helen's just said, I wish you died on the battlefield. Like, it's a lot, and it very much reminds me of Feyre being so strong, and also Feyre being a different kind of strong. Like, I think what I've seen is not a lot of credit for how much agency Feyre has. I know that people have had their qualms with Feyre, especially when it comes to later on in the series, but the way that she is so powerful in her own way, even at times when she can't fight 100%, she is so like Helen. I know that was a little bit more of an abstract linking to the books. Hopefully you kind of see what I'm seeing in the Helen, Paris, Menelaus dynamic between our 3 main characters in the first 2 books. But now we have come to the time where I need to do some quick fire Greek mythology references that really happen from books 3 to book 5. So let's roll into those. These are not going to change the way that you read the story. They are oftentimes not even used in a Greek mythology way, but the words are used, and so I wanted to take a chance to highlight them because, again, like I said at the start of this, you will blink and miss them. Like, literally, if you are drinking coffee or you're drinking a tea at the same time as you're reading, you're not even going to realize it because you're going to be like too focused on the steam hitting your face, or like the end of the cup will cover the word. Like, it's not that big of a deal, but they were there, and so I want to pull them out just so that we can all be on the same wavelength. And maybe then, you know, when you go and you meet up with your friends, I don't know, you can be like, oh, hey, did you also catch this on page whatever it is? This is from Greek mythology. Just like a nice little thing to throw into a conversation. Maybe it's just because I'm a nerd, but I think they're fun. Number 1 is the character of EROS. And not particularly his character, but his name. EROS, for you guys, just to jog your memories in case you read this a while ago, or maybe you're watching this without having read the books, like you've just decided to watch this whole thing, in which case, hi, you must be so lost. But EROS is Lucien's brother. He is the heir to the Autumn Court, and his name is actually from an ancient Greek goddess. EROS is a she, not a he, and she is the personification, she is the deity who is in charge of discord, strife, contention, and rivalry. And her most famous episode in all of Greek mythology is when she is not invited to the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. Now, if you guys don't know who those people are, that's totally okay. Those are just Achilles' parents, and this is important in the general idea of the Trojan War, knowing like the backstory to it. For the purpose of this video, you don't need to know about that. But EROS doesn't get invited to this wedding because she's the goddess of discord and strife and all of these things you like don't want at a celebration, so it like makes sense. But she doesn't like that she's the only goddess who's not invited, which I also get. So EROS decides to show up anyways. She shows up to the wedding and she rolls in this golden apple. It says "Te Caliste" on it, which means for the fairest. And as you can probably guess, because this room is filled with gods that have too big of an ego, 3 of them decide to lunge for the apple thinking that it's for them. Right, so the 3 goddesses are Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite. The 3 of them lunge for it, and this leads to the judgment of Paris. I do have a video about this, which you guys can hear about more. But that's the connection of Eros's name. So it kind of makes sense that Eros, throughout the books, he is very uncomfortable to read. So it makes sense. It doesn't govern his character, but I was like, that was smart. The second reference to Greek mythology you probably didn't realize was Andromache. And this truly is a blink and you'll miss it. This pops up in A Court of Wings and Ruin, when we have Moore, who's talking to Flaroh about her sexuality, and she talks about this woman who she was interested in called Andromache. Now, this character is not related to the ancient Greek world in any kind of a way, but the name is used in the mythology about the Trojan War. Andromache was the wife of Hector, who is a prince of Troy. He is the brother of Paris, and he's famously, if you guys have read the Song of Achilles, you guys will know that Hector is the guy who kills Patroclus, and because he kills Patroclus, Achilles then kills him. So Andromache is his wife. The third reference is Thanatos. And this literally is only said once. And this is when they're in the Night Court, when they're in the Court of Nightmares, and somebody references that Thanatos is doing something. That's it. We don't even meet him. And in case you guys don't know, Thanatos in Greek mythology is, oh god, okay, bear with me for a hot second. He is the god that ushers the dead souls to the underworld. So he is technically the god of death. Now, I know that you're going to be thinking, isn't Hades the god of death? No, Hades is the ruler of the underworld, and in ancient Greek mythology, everything is unbelievably specific. Okay, we have gods that do really particular things, especially those in the underworld, and Thanatos is the guy that I tend to describe more so as the Grim Reaper of the ancient world. So when somebody dies and their soul is shit, now what? He will go and get that soul and bring that soul down to the underworld. The other god who can do this, by the way, is Hermes, in case you were I swear to God the messenger god can do it. You're not wrong. He's the only one that can do that, and he doesn't always do it. It's just because he's a messenger god. It's really Thanatos' role. So that's who he is, and I can't relate him to the character whatsoever, because the character doesn't do shit. If the character comes up in the next book, I will be back. But at the moment, that's just a fun fact. We have 3 more references to go, and then I swear we're going to wrap this up. But the third to last one is the Myrmidons, which is noted as a mountain range. And this is actually a direct reference to Achilles' army from the Trojan War. So where he's from, Pythia, the army is called the Myrmidons. That's it. Pegasus is our penultimate reference. And this is because Helen in, I think it is A Court of Silver Flames. I'm pretty sure it's Court of Silver Flames. Helen has a Pegasus. However, in the book, and this always happens in fantasy, and I don't know why, I don't know where it started, but at some point someone decided that Pegasus, there's flocks of Pegasus everywhere, and there isn't in Greek mythology. I hate to tell people this, but I'm there's one. That's it. The one Pegasus in Greek mythology is not linked to Hercules or Heracles, depending on Greek name or Roman name, unlike what Disney will have you believe. Unfortunately, he is actually linked to a character called Bellerophon. And the reason why we probably don't know about Bellerophon is because his name is a fucking mouthful. And to try and sell a Disney film as Bellerophon is not as easy as selling one which is Hercules or Heracles. And I totally get that. But it means that we have multiple generations of people that assume that Pegasus was ridden by Heracles or Hercules. He's got his own shit. Heracles is busy. He has no time to deal with a Pegasus on top of his 12 labors and then getting on the Argo, and that's not the point of this video. But what I'm trying to tell you is that there's one Pegasus. It is linked to Bellerophon in ancient Greek mythology. And actually, fun fact, he's born from the severed head of Medusa. Who would have known? Now you do. And the last reference to the ancient Greek world is the child that Flaroh and Rhysand end up having in A Court of Silver Flames. And they name their son Nyx. Now, this I thought was so appropriate because Nyx, for you guys who don't know, is the primordial deity in ancient Greek mythology of the night. Okay, so let me just break that down. A primordial deity is one of the first deities from the ancient Greek mythology family tree. So at the start of everything, according to Hesiod. So if you want to read, by the way, this whole family tree of gods, read Hesiod. But chaos is the first thing to come into existence. And after chaos, booms a couple of other gods. And one of these other gods is Nyx, who is the goddess of night. Now, I do not want that to be confused with darkness, because Nyx, as the goddess of night, does have a coupling with Erebus, who is the god of darkness. Because, again, if you're thinking about night, night is just like a part of like the cycle of the day. So that's how the Greeks saw it, that it was like, okay, well, night doesn't necessarily include the dark. Like the darkness is a separate aspect to the night. The night is like the absence of the sun, and then the darkness is the absence of light. And so therefore, Nyx and Erebus, they join together and they have a couple of kids. One of them is the day, Hemera, cute. But them naming their child Nyx, even though he's a boy, there's a lot of gender swapping in this. I actually quite like that. But naming him Nyx, given that he is the child of the High Lady and High Lord of the Night Court, makes sense, right? It's just another word for night. And I think it's really sweet. And I really liked that nod to the ancient Greek world. But this video is so long, so it is about time that I wrap this up as quickly as possible. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope that you guys have enjoyed learning a little bit more about Greek mythology, seeing what you can spot in this series. There is so many other book series that do such fun things with Greek mythology and with the ancient world. And I have videos of those books and of those things over on my channel. So definitely check out more videos if you're interested in topics like this. But if not, I will love you and leave you. Thank you so much again for checking this out. And I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. I'll see you guys then.